This morning we're starting a new series on wilderness as we're looking at Lent, as we're looking forward to Easter. Before we get there, God calls us to a time of preparation, to a time of examining who we are and where we're at. And those stories, aren't always Instagram happy, right? Reality isn't always Instagram happy. We know that. We know that's true. And this morning we're going to look at some stories in the Bible about wilderness and about how God uses wilderness in our lives, even though it can be uncomfortable. Nobody wants to be in that place. We don't plan to be in the wilderness, right? But God always meets us there and uses those times in powerful ways in our lives if we allow him to. Ernest Shackleton led his team through one of the greatest wilderness experiences of all history. Shackleton was an Antarctic explorer who had started out in 1914 with a mission to be the first person to cross Antarctica on foot. Now, some penguins might argue who was first, right? But we're talking about people here. So by November 1915, his ship, the Endurance, aptly named, right? The Endurance, it had been crushed by sea ice, and his crew of 27 were stranded on an ice floe. After they made it to this tiny, uninhabitable Elephant Island in spring of 1916, the following year, Shackleton made the decision to go for help. He decided, I got to go for help because we're not going to survive otherwise. He and 5 other men sailed their largest lifeboat for 800 miles on the open sea, on the planet's roughest ocean, to the island of South Georgia. The crew faced icebergs, enormous swells, gale force winds, waves of icy seawater pummeled their bodies in this little boat. They barely slept or ate or drank for 2 punishing weeks. They were out on the ocean. Finally, after battling all the way to get to this island, a hurricane hit and didn't allow them to land. And they had to battle through the hurricane just to get to land. Having landed, they faced a mountain range that was covered with snow. They had to scale the mountains and get to the other side just to get to a little Norwegian whaling station where they could find another living person where they could get help. Several weeks later, they were able to go back and rescue the remaining men who they had left behind, and all 27 men from the expedition survived. Not one of them died. Shackleton is quoted saying, "Difficulties are just things to overcome, after all." Chapter 3, verse 17, we read about this. "Cursed is the ground," God said. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. And by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." This wasn't God's plan. This isn't what God made humanity for. And yet it is what sin created in us when we don't trust God and we turned away from him. We were created as garden people. Adam and Eve were immortal. Not even death touched them. That's how God created them. And yet we're not there anymore, are we? All wilderness in human history is a result of that one choice in the garden. All of our wilderness today that we experience, all the ways that we look around and we obviously can see that things are not right in the world. Whether it's in nature, through hurricanes and destruction, or in the wars or injustice that are around us, we can look and it's plain to see. We're in a time of wilderness. Things are not right. Romans chapter 5, verse 12 says this: Therefore, just as sin entered the world through this one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. But listen to this promise Paul says to the Roman church, 5:17. How much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and of the gift of righteousness reign in life through that one man, Jesus Christ? And Paul's making this distinction. Yeah, it was through this one man, Adam, that we all now know this wilderness that we're in. And if we're tempted to say, Adam, way to go, you blew it for us all, right? And that's what Paul is saying. Through Adam, we all know what brokenness feels like, it looks like. And if we're tempted to blame Adam, though, the reality is we all can point to ways in our lives that we also have made the exact same choice over and over. Not just a mistake, not just a whoops, but we have intentionally done what we know ourselves is not right, haven't we? We have chosen that path for ourselves. So none of us can look and blame anybody else. But Jesus said, the wilderness came through one man. Our path back to the garden, our path back to relationship is through one man also, that man, Jesus Christ, and what he's done for us. Listen, God is not waiting for heaven to restore us to relationship with him. God's not waiting. He wants to do it right now. Every time we come to God in our daily time with Jesus, when we abide with Jesus, that is our oasis in the wilderness. It is the place where, in a small way, we meet God again. We experience the garden again. We experience that place that we were made for, that place where God walks with us in the cool of the day. And so we are called every day back into that place where God is waiting to walk with us also. We are being invited. Years later, Abraham and Sarah also experienced wilderness of a different kind. God moved them to a brand new land, and they obeyed and they followed. And God made a covenant with them. They would be the start of God's plan to return humanity back from the wilderness. And Abraham, God said, it's going to start with you. I'm going to use you in ways that you can't even imagine. God promised and made a covenant to restore the whole world back into relationship with him. Even though Abraham and Sarah were approaching 100 years old, still God said, that's no problem for me. That's not a problem. God promised, you're going to have a child, and through this child, I'm going to bless the whole world. But instead of trusting God once again, Abraham decided, I better find my own way out of this wilderness. I'm not sure God's got the plan all worked out. I'm going to help him out. And so he took Sarah's slave, Hagar, and he got her pregnant. And not only did she get pregnant, but then they began to abuse her. Sarah treated her poorly, and because of their abuse, Hagar went out into the wilderness. And out in that place that Hagar did not choose, God met her face to face. Genesis chapter 16, verse 13. Hagar's response to God was this: you are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. This is Hagar's experience in the wilderness that she did not choose. Do you notice a pattern? When we fail to trust and obey God, somebody is going to end up in the wilderness. When we choose not to trust and obey God, somebody's going to end up in the wilderness. In his love and his grace, God sees us and meets us in that place, whether it is our fault or someone else's fault. God promises he will meet us there. One more story. It's the story of Moses. When drought and famine hit the people of Israel, they moved south, the whole lot of them. They moved south just to survive, and they moved down to Egypt where there was food and where they could survive. And once they moved there, they ended up staying for 400 years. You want to talk about a guest that has overstayed their welcome? 400 years, that's a long time to stay in the spare bedroom. To put it in perspective, our nation, the United States, this year is celebrating our 250th anniversary. So, double that, and you've got about the amount of time that they were in Egypt. And after a period of time, the Egyptians started to fear the Israelites because they grew so large, so strong, and they were having so many babies. They started to fear they would just take over Egypt, and so they made them into slaves. And this is the place where their wilderness began. But God heard their cry for help, heard their place of wilderness, and he went and he tapped Moses on the shoulder and he said, I've got a plan for you. I've heard the cries of my people. I want you to go. I want you to go with a message. But Moses, the place where Moses was wilderness itself. He was a sheep herder out in the back 40, literally, when he saw a bush that was on fire, and he watched this bush that was on fire, which itself is odd, but it just never burned up. He said, something's strange about this bush, because no bush burns that long. And so he went over to it, and that was the place where God called him and said, you're on holy ground. He said, I've heard the cries of my people. I want you to go. Take my message. I'm calling them out of their place of slavery. The place where Moses experienced God's call, listen, it wasn't a place of comfort. It wasn't a place of success. Moses wasn't the CEO of a big tech company. Right? He wasn't experiencing the top of what anybody would call success. He wasn't a political leader. He was a lowly shepherd, and he was tending sheep out in a plot of land that wasn't great. But this is where God found Moses, and he called him. Actually, last week we talked about trust fund babies, right? Moses was a trust fund baby. If you remember his story, when he was a baby, he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he was raised in the palace. You couldn't get a place of greater comfort and wealth than the palace of Pharaoh in Egypt. He was literally a trust fund baby. But as so many times, there came a point of trusting God when Moses failed to trust God, and it thrust him out into the wilderness. In Exodus chapter 2, we see the story of Moses, how, even though he was in this place of luxury, one day he saw one of his fellow Jews being beaten by an Egyptian, and he murdered that Egyptian, killed him. And he was kicked out into the wilderness. And his life would be different forever. Exodus chapter 3 says this, Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And if you remember, this mountain of Horeb is Mount Sinai. It's the same mountain where they received the Ten Commandments. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. For the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, and God called him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses' response, here I am. Here I am. Listen, we all experience different kinds of wilderness. The question is, how are we going to respond? Sometimes, like Adam and Eve, our wilderness experience is a direct result of our own choices, our own sin. We've all got stories, some we're willing to tell, some that we don't want anybody to know about decisions that we have made not to trust God or not to obey God, even though we knew what was right, and it ended up in our own wilderness. Places that we needed help to get out of. It didn't work out well for us. And then we had to deal with the challenge of wrestling with, I put myself here. There's shame, there's guilt. We doubt, can God love me again after this? Not only are we in wilderness, but we feel alone and distanced from God. There are times in that place of wilderness we distance ourselves from God. God doesn't want someone like me in his presence. You don't know what I've done. And yet, as for God's part, he always meets us there. Even in a wilderness of our own making, he meets us there and he calls us back to him. Sin makes garden people into wilderness people. Sin makes garden people into wilderness people. Other times, the wilderness that we experience is not the result of our sin, it's the result of somebody else's sin. And we've experienced that too. Abraham and Sarah didn't trust God fully. As a result, they turned and they abused Hagar. And Hagar ended up in a wilderness of her, not of her own choosing. She didn't choose to be abused. She didn't choose to be abandoned. And yet God met her there. Other times, like Moses, we're called to move and to act to help other people in their wilderness. God called Moses to risk his life and to go to the people of Israel and call on the Pharaoh to set them free, to call them out of the place of slavery, oppression, and suffering. Lead them into the land where God promised them. You know, Moses had his own challenges to deal with at that moment, right? I mean, he was a shepherd, and if you're a shepherd in the back shrub, something's gone wrong with your life plan. You know, because nobody sits down and writes it all out and says, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to get a master's degree, and then I'm going to go be a shepherd out in the wilderness. Nobody does that. Something's gone wrong with your life plan. He went from riches to rags. That's the wrong direction. From the palace to the desert. Moses had this stuttering problem where he couldn't even speak to people very well. Yet that was the moment God called him specifically. I've got work for you to do, work that I've gifted for you to do. Nobody else can do it. Are you willing? God did not create you for the wilderness. God did not create you for the wilderness. So the wilderness that you're experiencing, that you've gone through, that wasn't your purpose. That's not what you're created for. And God is continually inviting us back to the place where we belong, to be garden people again, the place of relationship, walking with God. Abiding with God started in the garden, right? As we talk about this year, what it means to abide with Jesus, to remain with Jesus, that wasn't a new concept. It started in the Garden of Eden. It was what we were created for. It was a place of encouragement, of joy, of growth, of purpose, of relationship. It's easy to walk with God in the cool of the day when everything's going right, isn't it? When everything's going well and it's smooth sailing, it's easy. But when we're in the wilderness, what about then? What happens then? In the New Testament, Paul knew what wilderness was like. He was on the fast track to becoming one of the greatest rabbis that ever lived. He probably had genius-level intelligence. He was on the fast track, but God called him away from that to his purpose, to his own purposes, right? And he ended up being almost beaten to death. That's a little bit of a different, right, career path. And yet this was the place, despite the suffering, that Paul experienced the joy of walking with God. 2 Corinthians 12, Paul writes this, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. God, I don't understand that. Doesn't even make sense. That just breaks human logic, doesn't it? But this is God's logic. This is God's truth. My power is made perfect in weakness. In your place of wilderness, you will see my power at work. Paul went on to write this to the church in Rome, Romans chapter 8, verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Verse 26, in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. Verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. This morning, if you have experienced time of wilderness, maybe you are in the wilderness yourself right now, and you're wondering, where is God in all of this? I would just encourage you to rest on the words of Paul this morning, this calling us back, that your wilderness doesn't define you. Your wilderness, what you're going through, your failures, your difficulties, the challenges that face you do not define you. You are not made for the wilderness. You are garden people. You are defined by relationship with God. You are more than conquerors. And he didn't say that tomorrow you are going to experience complete victory. He didn't promise that, did he? He said, this is who you are despite what you experience now. And the calling is to look beyond the present into God's future of who he's called you to be. Look into the future and trust God's definition of who you are in Jesus. You are more than conquerors. In fact, what God's promised is not merely that your present wilderness will be taken care of, your present challenges will be made right. More than that, you will be seated at the right hand of God. You will be with him in his presence. That is the place that Jesus will bring you. And so it's not a place of denial, right? God isn't calling us just to be happy-go-lucky and to ignore the challenges that we face, the difficulties that we're in. He doesn't just say, turn a blind eye to it. The people around us in their wilderness, that like Moses, God is calling us to go to them, to be sent to them, to help them in their wilderness. God does not say, ignore what is going on. But he says, as you are in the wilderness, don't allow it to define you. God has more for you. This morning, I want to invite you again. Are you taking time in the garden every day? Are you spending time in your one-on-one with God every day, walking with him, allowing him to speak to you? And secondly, Who is experiencing wilderness right now that God is sending you to? Are you praying for them? Are you investing in their life? Are you inviting them to the goodness of God?